this is the official start of our event. We'll pass it on to Sarah for our land acknowledgement this evening. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a white settler on these traditional lands. Thank you, Elder Doreen, for that beautiful opening. So while our event today is being shared from Calgary or Mohkinstsis, we recognize that many of you may be joining from other territories. And so I see a lot of people are already using the chat function to share where they're joining us from, and encourage you to keep doing that. That's great to see. In the spirit of our endeavors to promote reconciliation, we acknowledge that we organize, work, live, and build community on the traditional homelands of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, their Treaty 7 co-signatories, the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda. Alberta is also home to Métis Region 3, and we recognize as settlers and as guests on these traditional Indigenous lands, we express our gratitude and appreciation and respect for all of the Indigenous people who live here and share our knowledge with us. We are all treaty people. Treaty 7 was and is a promise between nations to share the land and support one another. And it is up to each and every one of us to work to make this place and the world better for all future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks. So welcome again to those who just joined us. I will provide you with a quick agenda overview of the evening. So tonight we'll be hearing from 4 incredible women who have been activists in the anti-racism and anti-colonial space here in Calgary for many, many years. We are honored and humbled by their presence with us tonight. So thank you really for joining us. So we will have a panel and some time for Q&A until about 7:30. Then we'll have a very, very quick break and we'll head to our breakout rooms. So that's about 7:35, 7:40 until about 8:15. We'll have small conversations. We'll share about what we've just heard. And of course, we'll focus on action items. We are truly equally committed to holding space for great learning, conversations, and taking action. I think that's very important tonight. We'll come back together for a quick debrief as a large group and a closing, and we will part ways again at 8:30 p.m. I also wanted to briefly talk about ethical spaces. Creating and maintaining ethical space is a framework from the teachings of Dr. Willie Herman, professor with the First Nations University of Canada, for guiding respectful interactions across cultural differences in a way that upholds the fundamental integrity of all knowledge systems entering that space. It's a model that creates a space of mutual trust, respect, equality, and collaboration. So to help ensure this evening is a positive learning and a community experience for everyone, I would like to share with you tonight some guiding principles that we are all agreeing to while spending those few hours together. We welcome and respect everyone. We assume that everyone has good intentions. We all have capacities. We are all learning together. We appreciate diversity, value and respect everyone's voice. We treat and care for everyone equally. We recognize that we've all been socialized in a world full of institutionalized power imbalances and isms. We value confidentiality. We are open to discussion to ensure a safer learning environment. We embody and practice justice, liberation, and peace in our engagements with one another. That's one principle from Black Lives Matter. We honor the voices of people with lived experience. Additionally, I would like to quickly touch base on online spaces. They are very different from in person, as you all know. So let's remember, for example, to remain muted unless asked to unmute, or of course, if we are in our breakout rooms. We can use the chat feature if we have any questions, or if you're having any technical difficulties, our tech experts, Jessica and Amanda, are here to help. You are not required to turn on your camera, although we do appreciate seeing all the faces, but if you are feeling comfortable with this, you can of course turn off your camera, and we'll ask you not to record or take any screenshots tonight. So I will now turn it over to Lemlem and Lisa to introduce our wonderful panelists and begin our discussion tonight. Lemlem and Lisa.
Hi, yeah. Hi, thank you, Carol. Hi, everybody. And oh my goodness, this is such an overwhelming event, and I'm just so prepared today to just listen to everybody and be together in this amazing community. So thank you so much, everybody. Welcome again, as Carol said. Lisa and I are introducing our amazing presenters, and for me it is my honor to introduce first Doreen Spence, a grandmother. Doreen is a grandmother from a Saddle Lake Cree Nation and now resides in Calgary. She's a traditional healer, retired registered nurse, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, author, and human rights activist who served as a presiding elder on the working group for the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. At 83, grandmother is Doreen is still an active lodge keeper and support to many. So we're just really excited to hear from Doreen, and also Marva, who I have known for a long time. Again, Marva Ferguson is a daughter, a sister, auntie, mentor, friend, confidant to many. In her professional life, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Child Studies and Social Work in Mount Royal University. She teaches from anti-Black racism, critical race, whiteness theories. She's a mental health first aid instructor and a critical incident stress management facilitator. As PhD candidate at Memorial University, she's presently completing her research that focuses on the study of personal stories of Jamaican Canadian adults who migrated to Canada as children. Marva sticks close to her Jamaican roots and recently organized the Quick Response Project that provided resources for individuals to struggling with outcome of COVID-19. Lisa?
I'm also going to put my glasses on, Lemlem.
I know.
Lemlem was just saying to me, I have to run and find my glasses. So wonderful. So I'm going to introduce our other two speakers. And so Kamal Sehgal is here, and Kamal has over 25 years experience working in Canada's post-secondary system and the not-for-profit sector. Kamal is the executive director of the Alberta Network of Immigrant Women with an interest in social justice and research. And then finally, Rosemary Brown, also a friend, and it's so wonderful. I know these women have done so much great work over the years leading our communities. So Rosemary is, she's currently a member of We're Together Ending Poverty, WTEP, Justice for Palestinians, the Basic Income YYC Arts Collective, a Basic Income Calgary, YYC Arts Collective, Education Team, and Brentwood Cares. And Rosemary has been an anti-racist activist and educator since the early 1970s. So welcome to our four amazing panelists. We're so thrilled to hear from all of you. And as you might figure when we were asking the panelists to speak, you know, how do you ask someone to sort of capture all of their years of practice and work within a few minutes, right? So it's hard to do that, but we had a few guiding questions, and then we generally just said, speak to whatever's in your heart and share with us. But some of our guiding questions were sharing a little bit about their her story in the work, something about what sustained or sustains them, you know, over this period of time of doing this work, and then maybe something about the changes they've seen, and some advice that they might want to give those of us who are growing and emerging in this work. And so we gave those as guides, but our presenters might speak on whatever's in their hearts and minds today, and we're really excited about that. Just to let everybody know, we're going to have ask all of our presenters to share first, so they get a chance to really come and share what they had planned to talk to us about, and then we will open it up for a brief question and answer period before we go into some small groups. So I think that's it for me. Carol, did I cover everything that needs to be covered before we start with our speakers?
Yes, you did. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to turn the mic over to Elder Doreen Spence. Thank you, Doreen.
Thank you. Wow, welcome, all my relations. I've been an activist for most of my 83 years of life. As a child, I came through the darkest times in the history of Canada for Indigenous peoples. There was a time when we could not leave the reservation without a pass. The Kamal had to be there to let us in and let us out, the Indian agent. There was also a policy that we could not get an education beyond grade 3. And I experienced daily racism in school because I went to an all-white school. It was a time when racism was allowed to flourish, and nothing much has changed today. I learned quite early to be my own advocate. So one day, when I was about 8 or 9 years of age, I asked the teacher if I could play on the boys' team, play baseball with them. And she told me I couldn't because I was a girl. But I had no friends. None of the girls would talk to me or play with me. So one day I decided that I was going to confront the teacher. I went in at recess time and I said to her, "What would you do if they told you you could not become a teacher because you're a girl?" And I knew that she couldn't answer me. So I turned around and I went out of the school. A few little talks with my teacher, I finally convinced her that I could play on the boys' team. And that was the beginning for me. Once I became one of the best little baseball players on the boys' team, of course, all the boys loved me and the girls began to talk to me. So I won that one. And even as the government put restrictions on our education as Indigenous peoples, there were many battles for us to fight and to be able to take control of our own education. And I managed to put myself through 3 years of Bible college, by scholarships and perseverance. And again, I was the youngest one in that college, and I was the only Native. So for me, it's been a lived experience. I also wanted to pursue nursing. But when I got the application forms, it said landed date of immigrancy. So you had to be an immigrant. It also asked for my date of birth. So I put July 25th, 1937 for my landed date of immigrancy, the same for my date of birth. And I said, Creator, I'm not lying. That's the day I landed here. Fortunate for me, I didn't have to send in a picture, but I sent in my academics and I got accepted. When I arrived my first day of class, the instructress singled me out right away. And she came over to me and she asked me, what are you doing here? You don't belong. And that's essentially what I'd heard almost daily up to that point. And she said, that filthy hair, you have to do something about it. So she told me I had to cut my hair, my braid off at the back of my skull before the next morning. I did. I went to the hairdressers. I got my hair cut. And I never felt so violated in all my life. But I persevered. I stuck through. I finished my nursing. And then shortly after I graduated from nursing, I'd been employed with the federal government at it was the old Charles Council Hospital in Edmonton, Indian and Northern Affairs. So I got seconded to go to High Prairie Hospital as a head nurse in charge of the surgical unit. So I went up and I took over. I wasn't there very long, maybe 3 months. And one morning I went to work and I saw this chart, this young 13-year-old child, Indigenous girl, going for a tubal ligation. There was no consent form. She didn't know what she was going for, nor did her parents. I had to think fast. So I thought, well, if I give her breakfast, if they give her breakfast, it'll give me time. So I went by with my little med cart and I took her fasting card off her tray. And so they gave her breakfast. That gave me time to run down town, and I went to the telegraph office and I sent a telegraph to the Attorney General. It said, urgent. I am potentially going to lose my license. I have a 13-year-old child going for a tubal ligation, and there is no consent form. Her parents aren't aware, nor is she aware of what she's going for. And so, please advise. The Catholic Constitution, however, states you cannot force someone to do something against their religion. This is against my religion. Please advise. Needless to say, I got called in by the afternoon. Who was I to question a doctor? And all the priests, the nuns, everybody that had a name was there. And I was in this big boardroom for hours. I had to get on the bus that night by 8 o'clock. I was on the bus, came back to Edmonton, left all my stuff up there. I just had a couple uniforms and a couple pairs of my nursing shoes. Came back to Edmonton. That was the time they were randomly sterilizing not only Indigenous young girls, women, but also those with disabilities. And those with Down syndrome were high on the top of the list. I didn't lose my license. I went on to spend about 40 years in the field. There was a time when I was frustrated with things not happening here in Calgary. It seemed that there was only just a handful of us. There was Rosemary and Lisa and Dr. DePaz and myself, I think, just a few of us that seemed to be meeting constantly. And I was behind the blockade with the Little Buffalo people, the Libicon Cree. And I saw how they were intimidated. They had the low-flying planes come in so that we wouldn't sleep at night. And so I had the young people at the back gate. And so we'd get our drums and our rattles and we'd sing all night long, and then we'd sleep during the day. I got to meet a couple people from the UN observers from Geneva behind the lines. And so there was a point where I was asked, they asked me to come to Europe. They were trying to organize a sacred run and it wasn't going too well. So I spearheaded a sacred run through Europe. I specifically led the group. I would get up early in the morning and run down the road. And when I'd get tired, they'd come and get a little van and I'd get a rest and meals. But eventually we ended up at the back gates of the United Nations. And when I arrived in Geneva, I was quite famous by then because we were filmed every day and I got to speak to all these mayors. I also was given a forum where there were thousands of people at on the Gordon in Bern at a Rockstar conference, and Steve Sehgal, an Indigenous man from North Dakota, invited me to speak to the people. So I arrived there and I told them about what it was like living in Canada as an Indigenous person. And so we garnered an awful lot of support for our work at the UN. So when I spent over 2 decades on the working group for Indigenous peoples, and I was pretty well the one that would get up in the morning, early in the morning, open with ceremonies, open with prayer. And at the end of our 2 decades there at the UN, my goal was to have every one of those government officials stand in the UN. When I got up to do the opening ceremonies or the closing ceremonies, they stood up in reverence of the prayers and in honor of the work that we were doing. And that to me was the highlight of the work I've done. My advocacy for others is interconnected with the work that I do as a lodge holder, as a keeper, as an elder. I wear many hats in my community, and so this work has taken me locally, nationally, and internationally. I sat on the International Council of Elders for probably about over a decade out of New Zealand. And so I had the great honor and the great privilege of meeting some of our most profound leaders like Nelson Mandela and the great Dalai Lama. In my time here since my retirement from nursing, I'm still very busy and very active. Currently, I'm still on a human rights committee supporting the young people and mentoring them. I am also on Mount Royal University. I come and help them with circles. Also with AIM High Group from the University of Calgary. And so I have remained committed it is something that I feel human rights is the umbrella for all, for education, for health, for social justice, for everything that I do. I really believe that human rights is the most important. It is ironic that we should be talking human rights. Recently, I've emailed Premier Legault because of the Joyce Echequan case, and I implored him to fire the orderly and the nurse and to educate the staff with Indigenous culture and that. I also implored him to identify systemic racism does exist, and he did. And there were a couple days of hearings here in Calgary recently with Black Lives Matter, and I did an intervention there. I also implored our mayor to identify systemic racism does exist, and he did. He made that statement. I specifically targeted that because our premier, Jason Kenney, states that there's no such a thing in Alberta. And so anyway, that's just a little bit of some of the work that I do. It's hard to put it all into a few minutes, but thank you very much. We cannot let this go. Racism hurts. Our elders always used to tell us as children, your words will either hurt or they'll heal, and hopefully ours will heal. So I implore everyone that's listening to really do your ultimate best. We have to change the mindset that we have right now. And this is a great opportunity with COVID, when we have all this time to reassess and reevaluate our own values. Then let's take it forth from here and let's show them. Lead by example. Hi, hi, all my relations.
Wow. Thank you so much, Elder Doreen. Yes, there's not enough time. I actually want to continue listening to you, and I've listened to the work you've done. You're so inspiring, and that's what we needed. I want to go in Switzerland right now, just the way you did it. And amazing that you're still doing the work. So now I wanted to ask Marva to speak next, if you can, Marva. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so very much for having me. I'm looking at the names in this space, and I'm recognizing some familiar names that I've known ever since I came to Calgary. But I want to start by thanking Lisa and Lemlem for inviting me to speak. As a matter of fact, I've known Lisa for a very long time, because Lisa was one of my practicum supervisor at Community Neighborhood Services. That's the name that I knew it as then. So that's many moons ago. And okay, I'll just tell you, I'm 57 and a half. So I've been around for a long time. My respect and honor to grandmother Doreen Spence, Kamal, Sehgal, with whom I've worked in this community, and Rosemary Brown. So I am in very good company. I also want to take the time to acknowledge that we are living in a pandemic, and our health is at risk, and therefore I honor the families, and I just wish that each of us are taking the time to, each of us is taking the time to attend to our health and well-being. So for me this afternoon, I am going to be talking about my work in this community. I want to acknowledge too that I stand on the shoulders of the Black peoples here in Calgary. They actually paved the way for me. They cleared the path, and they advocated for change. So my presence is just not about me coming and starting. It's about people who were here before me. They addressed the anti-racist policies in this community and in this society. And I'm able to speak with you and to share my experiences. So sometimes we say these things and we don't acknowledge individuals. And so I want to acknowledge the work of Joy Turner. And many of you have had patties and Caribbean food, but she was one of those in this community that contributed to the development. Dr. Janet Hurley, noted physician, David Est, we all know who David Est is, well-known educator. Dr. Pamela Dos Ramos, Donovan and Hermelin Simon from the Jamaica Canadian Association, and many from the Caribbean, African, international, our supporters and our allies. So I came to Canada in the fall of 1993. Came through Pearson Airport, and many of us know where Pearson is, because we all felt at some time in our life that Toronto was the center of Canada. I feel that Calgary is, but I mean, some people might not think that way right now. So there was a lot happening in 1993. And I recall coming from Jamaica, the country was going through what is known as structural adjustment. In Canada, it is referred to as recession. And complementing what was going on in Jamaica, Canada was going through its recession. So when I came here in 1993, I think it was just on the cusp of completing that recession that it was experiencing. And the then Prime Minister was Jean Chrétien. The Premier in Calgary or in Alberta was Ralph Klein, and our Mayor was Al Dwyer. We listened to music, Field of Gold by Sting. Peebo Bryson and Regina Bell sang A Whole New World, and of course, my world had just started here in Canada. And by the way, I just have to share a fun fact. I came to Calgary and discovered the bobsled team. And I was laughing at the fact that, I mean, what next are Jamaicans gonna do? Why are we doing this? Only to find out later, some years, about 4 years ago, my nephew was part of the team, so I stopped laughing. My employment here in Canada took me to retail stores where I was selling women's clothing. And it was at that very point that I became aware of the competitive nature in the Canadian society, and that for survival, most women, especially racialized women or Black women, were working in multiple jobs without benefits. Because you have to think, I was coming from a place where I had benefits, and now I was starting over in a society working at different multiple jobs without a safety net. And we now know that in many cases, most of our women, especially those who are immigrants and refugees, are at the lowest in terms of employment and are struggling with consistent jobs, and they're having to take whatever is available to make ends meet. And bear in mind that I can't go into a lot of details right now, and we're going to talk about that later on, because you've given me a short time to talk about my life, and I can't do it all in that short space of time. But volunteering was was another part of my job, because I felt that I needed to learn, as they say, the Canadian culture. And one of the ways where you could get a job in Alberta was to get a job experience by volunteering. I volunteered at the YWCA, where I met Yvonne Stanford. And later on, the YWCA was part of the establishment, or contributed to the establishment of the Women's Center. And if I'm saying that incorrectly, but I do know that the Women's Center was part of the YWCA until it became established. One thing that a lot of people do not know about, I've spoken to students about this, is that there was what is known as multicultural organizational change. It was called MOC at the time, and I was part of MOC. So you didn't hear about anti-racism. Sometimes you hear about diversity. And it was that term that talk about everything else except racism. Now I'm going to tell you that I had my fair share. I heard grandmother Doreen talk about her experiences. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to me here in Calgary. In the retail industry, it's very interesting to see what goes on in terms of selling, being available, being competitive. It felt sometimes that you were choking each other, especially as women. That was where the competitiveness started. Who sell what? How many you sold? And there was the picking or pitting people against each other. And I thought that this was interesting. But the other part was, that was where I really started to realize how Black I was, because I was referred to as the Black girl. I was told not to speak my language. And by the way, in Jamaica, we speak Patois, which is a colloquial language. There was also the surprise that I actually spoke English so well. There was a suggestion for accent reduction, which later brought me to the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, where I served as the chair of the board. And I really started to feel as if I was trying to keep my head above water, just because of the constant questioning, probing, interrogation. Who are you? You must be so poor. And the perception that, Jamaica being the third world country, that I was in need and didn't know much. I also worked at the shelters, and there was where I also started to see how racialized women were treated. It got me into trouble. And let me give you an example. Some of us in this site do remember when we got the Ralph dollars, because Alberta was really rich and we had money that we could give to each person in a family. And I remember it like yesterday when one of the workers said, we don't have to ensure that this woman got her benefits from the Alberta Works. It wasn't Alberta Works at the time, but I'm just using that term, because she got Ralph dollars, so she should be okay to leave the shelter. And I just lost it. I thought I was gonna be fired, but I stood my ground and I said, no, you can't do that. There was also the policy that said that each person who's leaving get 2 bags of belongings, whether it's grocery or clothing. I went down to the basement and I took out 4 bags because I said, you do not have the power to decide what this person's gonna be getting when we know that we have the resources, we have the help for the individual so we can do better. I was isolated afterwards, which is okay, because I really felt, as my father has always reminded me, do the right thing. I also went on to serve at the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. And at that time, it was directed by Linda Thompson, who is no longer with us. But what we also observed was that there was always a need to research immigrant women. And when there was, and when the research was completed, we had no contact, no information, and just like the person who would do the research or the agency and organization who would do the research, it became their property. And so there was no sharing, intersharing of information. So it became as if we were the test case in this society. Finally, we said, no, this cannot, it cannot continue. But there was this pushback. There was this assumption that, you know what, we can come in and do interaction, or we can do the research, we can get information from you because we have the power, so we can take whatever we want. And we had to really put our foot down. But the other part of it was sharing and talking about research and how it is used. And I even heard individuals say, well, is racism that bad in this society? And that was where I had to say, you know what? We're not going to stay here and discuss whether or not racism is bad. We just, whether or not it is bad for you. We know what it is because we feel it every day. And it meant educating and challenging the perception that one side can decide what you are feeling, what you are encountering, and to ascribe measurement to the practice and behavior. Personally, I also felt, or I experienced, a lot of barriers in accessing education. Because although I came with a college background, I had to redo or to restudy or to go back to university and start at square one. And starting at square one meant that even in the educational system, I did not see much in terms of the representation of what I looked like. And when I wrote from my own personal experience, there was a lot of pushback from some of the lecturers. So that was my experience with racism in this society or in this community. One of the biggest change for me recently was observing, and as you all know, the George Floyd killing in the United States. It was a drastic turning point for me. We asked the question, has there been any change? There are times I want to say yes, and the majority of time I say no. And here's why. I am involved in a research right now looking at the experiences of Jamaican Canadians who came to Canada years ago, and they were reunited with their parents. And I asked the question about racism. I look at what the research said 20 years ago, and I look at what the information is saying, or what they are saying in today's world. And it's devastating because it really is indicating that we have a lot of work to do. I started to talk about George Floyd, but what it has said to me that whereas there were times that I would reconsider what I would say or what I would do, and I've been doing it before now, I am more persistent in my work. And I challenge the status quo, no matter what the industry might be, because I think that we have a responsibility in making changes. Recently, we saw the demonstration in Calgary. I've never seen any demonstration of that nature in this community. Years ago, when we would go out and we would march, there would be challenges. We know that the KKK is here and living in Alberta. But this time, it felt different. And I also want to let our colleagues know that even though many of us are out on the streets demonstrating, there are many of us in the boardroom challenging policies and working towards change. So it doesn't mean that all of us have to be out there demonstrating in the streets. We also have recently, and I'm part of it, established the Alberta Association of Black Social Workers. And we're working really hard and challenging some of the policies and the status quo around becoming part of the ACSW. What else have I been doing? Using my voice, raising it, challenging, writing, teaching, challenging students to think outside of the box, to change the narrative, to listen to what they're hearing, to not believe everything that they read, and to ask questions. And with that, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Marva. It's wonderful to hear from you. And I mean, I've followed your work and some of the things that you've been doing over the years. It's wonderful to see you again and to see how passionate you are and how committed you still are and continue to be. And it's so needed. And that's a good question. We will return to, I think, in our small groups, what has changed, right? Have changes happened? And if not, what is our role and how we continue in this work together? So thank you. I'd now like to introduce Kamal, Sehgal, to speak. And I always call Kamal the mother of us all because she's always providing tea and snacks when you go to visit her. But today we will be online, so no tea and snacks, but very excited to hear from you, Kamal. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'd like to thank Lisa in London for inviting me to this evening. I had not thought about talking about myself as to what my thoughts were, but more to talk about, to highlight the story of Alberta Network of Immigrant Women's journey to understand racism and what it can do to address it. In order to do so, I will have to step back in time to capture the evolution of the work ANIW has done over the years and then focus more on the current work the organization is doing. The host has asked you to start your video. Okay. Now I'm learning all this new stuff, kind of, right? So bear with me. Do we have, I had a presentation, Lisa. Is there a way to do that presentation? Or is it just talking? I can do just the talking if that works.
Up to you, Kamal. I think we can make you a co-host if you wanted to share something.
I thought so because, all right, let's see what I can do and we'll work on it a little later on. So the work that ANIW has done, it's a small organization, 1984, 34 years old. And much of the work this organization does is on the basis of project work. And we acknowledge that there were funders like the Status of Women Canada, Alberta Human Rights Multiculturalism Fund, and Calgary Foundation, who believed in the work of this organization, who believed that this organization had the capacity to carry the work on. Our vision and mission is very simple. Help immigrant women reach their potential. And the work we do is on a very simple, basic principle to empower those that are most affected by the issue, to address the issue. Didn't realize how difficult it is to get them to address the issues where they're impacted, because there's so much of emotions that are involved in all the issues that have impact in our society. Anyway, recommendations from one project form the basis of the next project. And so therefore our projects are constantly evolving. And you will see this evolution of our projects as I talk about the work that we have done on our racism project. So over the years, ANIW has been a catalyst to a number of initiatives that now provide wealth of information to the immigrants in our community, such as the Alberta International Medical Graduates Association, Immigrant Access Fund that now is called Windmill, and the Calgary Regional Immigrant Employment Council. All these ANIW has been a catalyst and a nurturer, nurturing them for a number of years before they could be on their own. In 1971, Canada was the first country in the world to embrace multiculturalism. And yet in 2020, we wake up to the headlines in our newspapers and to the countless research documents released documenting systemic racism and discrimination exists in Canada. And even some of our politicians agreeing that it exists. So because it exists, what did this little organization can do? For this, I need to go back to the summer of 1999. Summer of 1999, we used to share the office space with the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. Women would pop into the office of ANIW, and in very hush words, they would talk about what was happening to them in their working lives. Some of them didn't have jobs, highly qualified. Others who had jobs talked about what it was like working in the field. I was fortunate enough to be friends with Wilma Dawson at the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. And I would talk to Wilma in my language and say, we need to get out of this office. And where would we go? We would go to Kirby Center cafeteria. Over dozens of cups of tea, and each cup served with 2 hot buttered toasts and jam at the cost of just $1. We would sit down and discuss the stories that we had heard from women and what we could do about that. My background is not in community development. It is not social work. my background was simply in volunteering for nonprofit organizations. So as we talked over hot buttered toast, I just couldn't let it go that women had talked about their experiences. Here was an organization and it needed to do something about it. In the summer of 2000, it took me one whole year thinking what the women were talking about. We organized an informal discussion group for women who had earlier shared their thought on how the workplace devalued their work. The focus group was facilitated by Dr. Cecile de Pass from the University of Calgary, and some of you may know her. As the women shared their painful, stressful experiences, there were tears and an enormous sense of being helpless. It was more than I could ever have taken in my life, hearing somebody's stories. It took us more than 6 months to recuperate from that emotionally charged discussion. We had the anecdotal experience, but coming from a scientific background, I did not have any documentation, and I needed that documentation to move forward with what was happening. So how is this racism constructed? How does it work? Why does it have this kind of an impact on people? Were all things that were buzzing through the head, and we needed to get something done. So much was unknown to us. But fortunately, my first lesson to understand racism was under Rosemary and Lisa Harry. They did a workshop at the Arusha Center. And I went to that workshop to learn what racism was all about. We had good mentors in Dr. Joan Ryan, Amal Umar, Cecile de Paz, Tina Lopez, and very often I heard Doreen Spence talk. And I would wonder, would I ever get a chance to talk to her personally? But I never did get that, except for the time that we invited Doreen for one of the occasions that we had to address racism and discrimination, International Day for that, elimination of racism and discrimination. Tina Lopez was the author of Dancing on Live Ambers and Challenging Racism in Organizations, who helped in more ways than I can even list. So my gratitude to all the women who came in my life to help out with the work that ANIW had to do. We learned how racism begins and its many forms, how it begins, the process begins with just somebody having selective information, very little information that is not even verified and is very general, and how that it manifests itself into biases and prejudice, stereotyping, prejudice, till ultimately it leads to institutional racism. So after educating ourselves and verifying, we needed to verify the stories, the anecdotal stories that we had. And so began our research on equitable treatment of immigrant and visible minority women as employees and volunteers in the Alberta volunteer sector. As the research began, there were so many statements made by women that we just could not publish that report because it would have identified which organization was involved and who the women were. So we dismissed that report completely. And we went back to Status of Women Canada and told them that we wanted to continue this report, continue the research, but on a larger scale across Alberta, so that nobody would get identified what they said. And sure enough, women indicated that they had high dissatisfaction in the workplace. There was lack of respect. They were being talked down to. They were being yelled at. Critical memos were being sent to them. They were treated as kids. Phone calls were being monitored, degraded in front of their co-workers, and so forth. It went on. And amazingly, the executive directors of many of the organizations felt just the opposite. Women had lost a lot of their self-esteem, their confidence. They absorbed many of the messages that were being delivered to them. One particular message that still stands out in my memory is of the young woman who said to me that, Kamal, every month I have to submit a report. I submit the report, but I'm told that the report is not good enough. And they send it back to me. I rewrite it and send it to my supervisor. The supervisor starts yelling and saying, don't you know how to write this report? Go get it fixed, and sends it back to me. And so forth it begins till it is the third week of the month. And then the report is accepted. I get 1 week of reprieve, and the next month begins. The report has to be written, and I go over this process all over again. Not once I asked her if she had asked the supervisor to give her a sample of the report that would satisfy him or her, and it was denied. There's no sample. You should be able to write a report. You are an educated young woman. You should be able to write a report. And so forth. These stories that were there were in how emotionally disturbed the women were, that it made us decide that we need to continue our research further into understanding how these emotions, loss of self-esteem, confidence, had an impact on the women. We didn't really have a word for this impact. And so there was a group of us where Linda Thompson, as Marva mentioned earlier on, she was the executive director of the Association for Immigrant Women. She was there with us. She was part of the program committee, Linda Thompson. And I spoke to Linda and I spoke to Wilma as well. And I said, what does this really mean? What is happening? And sure, why? And one of the words that came out was, they are just absorbing everything. They are internalizing everything. We didn't even know the meaning of internalized racism at that particular time. And so began our work on understanding what internalized racism was all about. And we worked on it, and our document aspect of racism seldom discussed came through. But when this document came up, along with this, the two documents, the earlier one that I mentioned on equitable treatment and the aspect of racism, women were front and foremost in all the work that we did. They were part of the anecdotal information they brought to us. They were part of the research session. They were part of our bringing the research back to them to be verified. They were part of the recommendations that they made. And what the two recommendations that they stood out for us was, there has to be more education and strategies to address racism and address the impact of racism that we are all feeling. And so began our work on understanding the definition of racism and how internalized racism had an impact. So to just leave a little bit of it, I understand racism can be institutionalized, it could be personal. We had to educate ourselves all the way through, kind of. There's no denying it. And internalized racism. But what stood out most in internalized racism for us was that how physiologically it had an impact. The brain absorbs all the racist messages that are coming through, whether they are coming through institutions, whether they are coming through individuals, whether they are coming through historically, or whether they are coming from the cultures that we come from. The brain absorbs all these. And as they absorb that, they release the hormone serotonin. There is a decrease in the hormone serotonin. And the serotonin hormone is known as the happy hormone because it contributes to the well-being and happiness of the individuals. And it regulates our sleep and wake cycles. And it also plays a role in the appetite and our emotions. So when it decreases, just the opposite happens. And that is you lose sleep, you have sleep disorders, and you have loss of appetite, etc. It also causes a decrease in the oxytocin, which is called the love hormone. It plays a role in socializing, bonding, sexual reproduction, childbirth, and period after childbirth. So when there is a decrease in this, there is emotional connection to the family, to those around us decrease. On the other hand, it increases the adrenaline. And we all know that adrenaline is the hormone that fuels the body for fight or flight messages. And so when you are in that situation, you may either fight with the people around you, or you may just leave everything under the table and just not react, flee away from those emotions that are there. It also has an impact on the cortisol steroids, which is a built-in alarm system in the body. It's your body's main stress hormone. It works with certain parts of your brain to control your mood, motivation, and fear. Talking about these hormones is an indication that how the stress of racism, the stress of internalizing racism has an impact physiologically on your body. And how when these physiological impacts there are repercussions of it, whether there are repercussions in the form of violence in the family, whether there are repercussions in you taking more drugs, there are repercussions on your health. And so the process of understanding was important for us to relay to the women that you have if you have an understanding of a certain things that happening to you, maybe you have control of trying to do something about it. What were some of the things that the women came up with? We came up with the fact that racism is socially constructed, and it has created these underlying problems that we talked about. So in order to do that, we socially need to come together to deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a manner that is equitable for everyone. If we remain silent, the deconstruction of racism cannot be done. We need to talk about it and not be held back thinking it is not politically correct or the fear of reprisal. And there is a certain power in connections and in community strength. Today, as we talk about this whole issue of racism and discrimination, I see the strength in the community that can be empowered to address and not stay silent anymore. The women also gave us the idea that in order to get this, not be complicit about our silence, what we need is a site where we can reconstruct our education, which requires community-based education and community-based healing. Healing is, but not in a clinical setting, but more in the community setting. What would this setting or learning about healing involve? It will involve people who have the knowledge and experience, who are comfortable in their own self, who have experienced racism, but have addressed it in themselves, and so on. In my presentation, we have a whole list of ideas as to who are these people who could facilitate these two documents. Having known these, that this is needed to be done, ANIW did the research to see if there was, across Alberta, if there were any programs that would help people who encounter racism and discrimination. We mapped out many of the programs, and all the programs that we had would make referrals to other organizations who in turn didn't really have any services that could help women or could help people who were stressed out by racism. And so we did another document for after the mapping, and that was a community framework to heal from racism. This community framework has information that many of the physicians in the United States are using to help with the diagnosis of their patients, so that they do not give their patients drugs, but give them the counseling that is required for them and refer them to the counseling, to the counselors that can help them through this process. So this research is right now on the back burner because we do not have the funds to take it further and build it into the community framework that the research is indicating that we should do. So with that, I thank you all for having begun the process. Thank you for this opportunity. Change is within our hands, and we need to take that to move forward. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kamal. Again, there's not enough time. We need like at least 3 or 4 days for each of you to listen to the amazing work you've done. Thank you, Kamal. Next, we have Rosemary Brown. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes,
okay.
We can hear
okay.
you.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Okay, first of all, thank you to Lemlem and Lisa for inviting me to be in this panel. It's wonderful to be with Doreen and Kamal, whom I've known for so long, and who just keep doing wonderful, inspirational work in the community. And it's been wonderful to meet Marva. I've heard so many good things about you, not only from Lemlem and Lisa, but some of your students, and I won't name who they are. I feel very humble sitting here. I am, as I said, I am a white settler. I do not have lived experience of racism and colonial oppression. I was born and raised in upstate New York, in Syracuse, New York, which is on the traditional lands of the Onondaga Nation, and now live in Treaty 7. I'm a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 7. And I forgot to put that in my introduction. Of course, that's so important, our family around us. We were asked to talk about how do we get started in this work. And to put it briefly, I blame it on my parents. My father grew up in a unionized working class family, and he himself was a union organizer for the Communication Workers of America and helped form and then served on the local of Empire State Telephone Union in Syracuse, New York for Bell Telephone. My mother's father was a white-collar worker. He was a bookkeeper, but he died when she was 5 years old. And from that point on, she and her family, they lived in poverty. My mother was a storyteller. And so she filled us with stories about her childhood, what it was like to grow up in poverty, what it meant to go to school with books that were stamped relief, what it meant to receive these tickets or stamps to go and buy your shoes. And so The shopkeepers were not that interested, and they would often not pay a lot of attention in sizing shoes. So you grew up with poorly fitting shoes. A big treat for her, she adored tuna fish. So a birthday present would be everyone chipping in for 1 tin of tuna to make my mother happy. She also told me stories about my dad and how in his union organizing, he was quite militant, in your face. His union button must have been this big, you know, to walk around the telephone company with to organize workers. My mother also told me a lot about what it was meant to be a woman in this world. So all my messages were about having to work harder than men to get ahead. There were messages about men who really, they don't necessarily like or respect women that much. And there were 2 stories related to childbirth that I want to share. When I was born, the doctor patted my mother on the shoulder and he said, "Well, my dear, you won't have to pay for a college education for this one." When my brother was born, my paternal grandfather clapped my dad on the back and said, "Well, son, now you're a man." And these kinds of stories meant that I grew up with a sense of, or not necessarily an understanding, but an awareness of disparity, of injustice, but also the importance of standing up, speaking out, and organizing. After university and spending time living in Nigeria and England, I came to Toronto with my soon-to-be husband in the 1970 and soon became very involved in radical politics. There was a lot of anti-racism organizing going on in the city at that time. There was the case of Henry Fong, the medical student at U of T, who was expelled because he didn't have the right bedside manner. There were many, many protests against the deportation of foreign visa workers. And out of that work, sorry, I'm having trouble reading my notes. And there was also related to the anti-racism work, but it wasn't so much racism as ethnic discrimination, protests at the Workmen's Compensation Board because a Workmen's Compensation Board doctor was claiming that Italian construction workers feigned their back injuries and therefore should not be compensated for their injuries. Out of all this work, a Black civil liberties lawyer in Toronto named Charlie Roach started up an organization along with some other radical colleagues known as the Committee Against Racism. This was a multiracial group. There are quite a few working people in this group. And again, the work continued, protesting deportations under the slogan of good enough to work, good enough to stay. And there were also cases at that time of police inaction around the killing of Black youth on the streets of Toronto. And there were big protests, et cetera, around that. I was in Toronto from 1970 until the end of 76. And the way I would, with one exception of a year away, and how I would summarize that work is it definitely focused on institutions. We didn't think of it as systemic racism, but we did talk about institutional racism. We also were very much committed to the idea of you did this work, especially from a class perspective, because racism undermined class unity and made the struggle of workers for a better life, working conditions that much more difficult. We didn't talk about whiteness, so we didn't talk about white supremacy. In fact, we didn't do internal work. We didn't study racism. Then at the end of 76, I moved to Calgary with my husband, a 6-week-old baby. And soon thereafter, in 1978, the Committee Against Racism in Toronto and Charlie Roach reached out to people they knew across the country because he had taken on the case of 7 women prepared to fight to defend their rights and their case became known as the 7 Jamaican Mothers. They were domestic workers who were being threatened with deportation because they had children. I won't go into the details of that case. It's something people can look up, but it was a critical case. And so I didn't really know anyone in the community, but I approached the Calgary and District Labor Council, and with a 6-month-old baby, my second son on my hip, I spoke before them, and they agreed to support the campaign of the 7 Jamaican Mothers. I reached out to the Calgary Status of Women Action Committee. They also supported. The Calgary Latin American Support Group, which was a combination of churches and a group representing, a group of different church representatives and Chilean exiles. All of these groups supported the cause, and people supported it all across the country. And this national campaign that had such broad-based support actually led to a ministerial reprieve for the women. And it also began the process of highlighting the condition of domestic workers in Canada, which Makeda Silveira so eloquently documented in her book, Silence. Out of that work, several of us then came together to form a chapter of the Committee Against Racism here in Calgary in 1979. And the work began with a focus on anti-apartheid work, very much driven by the ANC slogan of an injury to one is an injury to all. That was also a slogan of the workers' organizations in South Africa. Soon, however, we were being approached to address Indigenous and other issues of local racism. There's the case of John Chiefmoon, a farmer from the Blood Reserve, who was beaten up by the RCMP in a case of mistaken identity. Then there was the Nigerian auto mechanic student who was stopped by the police late at night as he was driving his wife home from her shift at the General Hospital. He was accused by the police of being a pimp, that she was his prostitute, all because of the beautiful car he had and that he maintained. They roughed him up. They charged him with resisting arrest. And so a friend who we had met through anti-apartheid work brought him to us. What could we do? And so we developed a campaign around his work. We attended a court where the charges against him were thrown out. The judge said the police just contradicted themselves, right, left, and center. However, his complaint against the police for the way he was treated was dismissed by the police and then later dismissed by the so-called impartial law enforcement appeal board, who went out of their way not only to dismiss his complaint, but to criticize the Committee Against Racism for agitating around what happened to him. And someone who's no longer with us, whom I'd like to pay tribute to at this time, who really helped guide us in the intricacies of the court things with both John Chiefmoon and the student was Sheldon Shumir, a civil liberties lawyer here in Toronto. CAR lasted here until about 1997. There were so many people involved. I'll try and remember. I'm just going to mention everyone. Doreen was involved. Donna McPhee, who's no longer with us. Sharon Prue Turner, who's no longer with us. Paul Fernandez, Don Dale, Donna Boyer, Ellen Atsu, Raymond Famalusi, Marlea Clark, Helen Campbell, my husband, Don Ray. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There were so many people involved over the years in that work. So this isn't about me, it's about a collective. Lisa Lorenzetti was involved, just a collective process. So I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. I'm having to lean over and look at my notes because I'm having trouble seeing them. So depending on the issue, we did all kinds of things. We held protests, we held rallies, we did fundraising, we had petitions. Oh boy. I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble with this. We just did a lot of organizing and a lot of work around a whole range of issues. We also built relations with others in the community who were doing anti-racism work at that time and who were speaking out. And this is in the 80s I'm talking about. So I'm thinking of members of the Congress of Black Women, Genevieve Ballaghan, who's no longer with us, Julianne Hendrickson, who's no longer with us, Dorothy Jones, and again, there were others. Members of the Faculty of Education at the University of Calgary, Cecile DePass, Matthew Zachariah, who's no longer with us. And then also reaching out to and meeting people working in different immigrant serving agencies. And I can't quite remember when I met Kamal. I just feel like I've known her for a long, long time with the work that she was doing. Oh boy. Okay. One thing that really strikes me looking back is we were criticized for talking about the racism that existed in institutions. This is within the community at large. This was among people who claimed to be concerned about multiculturalism, concerned about racism. They didn't want to hear about institutional racism. And we were also criticized because our name was Committee Against Racism. People felt that was too negative and it should be a more positive name. Well, you know, excuse me, racism is negative. Yeah, we're against it, and we didn't apologize for it, and we just continued. I would say that towards the late 80s, there was a significant shift that happened here in Calgary in terms of anti-racism work that impacted us within the Committee Against Racism and our understanding of racism and how to address it. And I will come back to that in a minute because I think it's so important. Before that, I want to talk a little bit more about something Doreen referenced, which was the international struggle of the Lubicon Lake Cree Nation to gain their land rights, to gain their traditional territory back, and to be able to control and stop full-fledged oil and gas exploitation on their lands. It was such a classic case of the government oil and gas industry bearing down on a very small, but a very proud and very ready to fight back community. We did all kinds of things. And again, you know, I mentioned people who are involved in CAR and people who are involved in this work. So, you know, we raised money for a legal defense campaign. We made buttons, we made posters, there were t-shirts. We held public forums, we had film showings. We also supported the boycott of the 1988 Olympics here in Calgary. And for many of us in CAR, that wasn't necessarily an easy thing to do. We had big discussions within the group, but after about 3 meetings, we were able to come to an agreement that allowed us to move forward in solidarity with the Lubicon. The request came from them to support the boycott. And so to do that, we organized a news conference and a big protest rally outside the opening of the Spirit Sings exhibition at the Glenbow Museum. We also had a permanent display up at the University of Calgary during the time of the Olympics. It was a display and information room around the Lubicon struggle. We protested the torch relay race, which again was not a very pleasant experience as people threw ice-filled snowballs at us, etc. And we stood there along with members of the Lubicon Lake Cree Nation to do that. And even before the boycott came down, we had organized a concert that was held at the Jubilee Auditorium with Buffy St. Marie in solidarity with the Lubicon Lake Cree Nation. Moving into the 90s, we organized a forum up at the University of Calgary in their ballroom, which held something like 800 people. Doreen Spence, I think you facilitated that panel, Doreen. David Suzuki was on that panel, and Bernard Omniak, the chief of the Lubicon Lake Cree Nation. So that work, it was a big part of our work, a key part of our work, and really deepened our understandings of how the state and how industry work to continue a colonial oppression and exploitation of lands and peoples, of Indigenous lands and peoples here in this country. And it's an ongoing issue, right? It wasn't about history, it was happening in front of us, and it still goes on today in other jurisdictions. As of the late 1990s, because of for all kinds of reasons, personal tragedies within the community, government meddling, creation of divisions, the struggle continued, but it was more low-key, and we weren't being asked to do a lot. There are a few things that we did. So we also, there was a women's circle, a Lubicon Lake Cree Nation women's circle that Don Hill, an Indigenous scholar from the East, helped to create. And they came down to Calgary and spoke at one point. But in general, the work slowed down. And it was not, the Lubicon kept going though. It was just very much quieter, etc., overcoming the divisions. They needed to heal within the community. And finally, in 2018, that land claim was settled. You had a confluence of the fact that that work continued, that there were many, many people across this country who continued to support the Lubicon, a liberal government which had committed itself, okay, to respecting Indigenous rights and reconciliation, and a new democratic government in this province that was not about to bow down and kowtow to the oil and gas industry. That's what finally brought a settlement to that land claim. And, you know, I've been in communication with women in the community, and, you know, now, you know, it's about healing the divisions within the community. That's part of the struggle is behind them, and the community can now move forward and build. Am I going on too long? I'll try and speed up here. But to go back to the 1980s. So the 1980s is when women of color challenged the women's movement with very deserved critiques of the racism which existed within that movement. And here in Calgary, we saw the creation of the Women of Color Collective. And again, there were so many people involved in that work. I'm thinking of Ravita Din, Mutriba Din, Aruna Srivastava, Janet Yee, Tao Vu, Lindy Macabella, Rita Wong, Hiromi Goto, the list goes on. And what that work did was to, what their work did, they brought in speakers, they spoke up at women's events. In the mid-90s, they created a project called the Alliance Project. And it just led to such a big shift, I think, for many of us in terms of our understanding of the nature of this work. And basically, the Alliance Project, we were separated, white women, women of color, Indigenous women. We met, we had readings, we had exercises to do, we had questions to answer, and then we would come together for sharing. And it was not a comfortable process, but it was that it shouldn't have been a comfortable process. And I came away from it realizing you need to embrace that discomfort, because that's how, as a white person, you're going to move ahead and you're going to learn. Another key learning had to do with there is such a gulf that exists between those of us who are white and have white privilege and those with lived experience of racism. That we can work hard, we can do a lot of learning, but we don't live it, right? What we live is working in this struggle, we hope, as an ally, which is something you need to earn, right, to become an ally. Also, lessons around the importance of, it's the impact that counts, not the intent. We learned about the defensiveness of white people. This is back in the 90s, right? Before white fragility, we were already being taught about the typical ways I as white people react when we're challenged around racism. They also brought forward the importance of the interconnection between different forms of oppression. And I remember Janet Yee talking to us as she said, okay, she's a woman of color, I'm a white woman. And though she says, so I have white skin privilege, but she is a woman of color, recognized, yes, she was a woman of color, yes, she experienced racism, but she also recognized that she was in other situations where she was the dominant person. She had more power as a cisgendered woman, as an able-bodied woman, etc. And that was a big lesson, I think, to bring home to all of us. Also, the importance of relationships and relationship building. And again, this is something Lem talks about all the time, the importance of relationship building. And I remember Paul Fernandez talking about the need for him to have a community around him where what we would say today is it was a community where it was safe and it was accountable, where you could challenge people and they weren't going to go running off, screaming, but they were going to listen, they were going to change. Oh boy. Also, the importance of taking the lead from people of color and Indigenous people in this work. But it was also made very clear to us that, yes, we should take the lead from Indigenous people and people of color, but that didn't mean that we were just licking stamps. It meant we had to engage, we had to speak up, we had to share our ideas, we had to bring ourselves to that work. But doing that meant we also had to be prepared to be challenged, right? And boy, I've had many challenges for how I've behaved, for things I haven't done. I remember Doreen very kindly and gently, but firmly taking me aside after a meeting where really my behavior was not so great and just laying it on the line to me. And I can remember Lindy Macabella. I was never challenged so much in my life as when I worked with her at Arusha. But you know what? What you learn from it is that you listen, you learn, you apologize, and then you change how you operate in the world. You try and become a better white anti-racism activist. Meanwhile, this was really big. We also within the Committee Against Racism had our own alliance project happening that Sharon Pre-Turner and Paul Fernandez led, and journaling was such a key part of that. And it was through that journaling that you really started digging down, and it's very upsetting to surface some of the racist attitudes that one holds, that they're buried, they're in there. But you know what? you surface them, then you can figure out where they came from, and you can you can deal with them, you're more aware of them. And meanwhile, they're not acting at a subconscious level and influencing how you work and interact with people of color and Indigenous people. And that was so important.
Rosemary?
I have to stop, I know. I'm just gonna stop.
So sorry.
It's okay.
No, just wrap up what you were gonna say. I just want to give you a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Just very quickly, a lot of these experiences and things overlapped with work at the Arusha Center, where I won't go into the background. There was a committee for anti-racism education established to address the issue of systemic racism at the Calgary Board of Education. Lisa Harry was part of that work. Later on, Lindy Macabella, Kara Morgan, DP, many different people, Viviana Reinberg. And so we had a community-based committee with, there were quite a few members from the Congress who joined, other community members, educators from the University of Calgary. Many different things happened. Research, what were people doing in Toronto to address systemic racism in the schools? Pulling together research the Aboriginal community had already done, not once, but twice, around the issue of how Indigenous children were treated in the schools. New research that was carried out by Dr. Cecile DePass at the University of Calgary with students and parents today of color. Then, under the guidance of Enid Lee, a Black educator in Toronto, having community consultations based on the research, then taking the research, the proposals that came out of the community, doing presentations with the board. You had the Catholic board who I'm sorry, but one trustee said, well, how can we be racist? We're Catholic. To give them credit, though, there was an administrator within the Catholic board, actually Lisa's aunt, who did continue to meet with us, tried to help us do workshops with educators. No, the teachers were not interested. And we see the results today with Black students out on the streets complaining about something that was already being raised years ago. The CBE, it was quite different. A whole process began. I won't go into details now. The upshot was one, the passage in 1998 of an anti-racism and equity policy at the Calgary Board of Education. And then the creation of a committee to develop an action plan. And that action plan was developed, but then, by then, unfortunately, Donna Michaels, who had been the chief superintendent, supported this work. She had left. The key CBE, Bill Dixon, I think, had left. He was so key, he worked with us. And then the other administrator who worked to develop the action plan, her husband died, she left the board. And then the interim chief superintendent, who did not support this work, and you knew it, you just had to meet him, you just had to talk to this white guy. He didn't support it. He pulled the plug on all that work, and then the anti-racism policy disappeared. And I'm gonna leave it at that. I've continued in different ways to do the work. Yes, there are learnings, et cetera, but you know what? It's just, there's too much to talk about. Thank you.
Mary, thanks so much. And I know it's been a short period of time, and there is so much to talk about, and there's so much history. And I appreciated hearing and remembering all the names of the people that have been with us to do the work. Many of them have passed on, and we're just grateful for what they've done. We're going to take a break. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We have promised people that we would go into small groups and talk action and talk about what we need to do moving forward. And we want to keep that commitment. I want to thank all our amazing speakers. Feel free to turn your video and audio off for 5 minutes to take a break. And when we come back, we will be moving into small groups. Thank you.
Everyone in their rooms, and